Yeah, okay, perfect. So welcome everyone, both here in the room and online to this Bruegel event on navigating public opinion dynamics for responsive governance. We are almost on a pre-electoral time. There are moments of heavy disruptions globally with policies in flux. And so it's really important, in our opinion, to discuss how we can tailor public responses to what people actually want. So we have three guests for this event. First off, let me introduce our first guest, Catherine de Vries. She's a Dean of International Affairs in Bocconi University, and she's a globally recognized expert on surveys. Then we have Joanna Hirscu. I hope I pronounce your name well. She's head of unit at the European Commission for the unit on media monitoring and Eurobarometer. So our one of the most important surveys in Europe, and I would say, key survey whenever we look at EU-wide dynamics on public opinion. And finally, we have Alexis Chalopin. Again, I hope I pronounce your family name correctly, who is a counselor in the French permanent representation responsible for industrial policy. So I will ask you a series of short questions. We adopt more of a roundtable format. Before we start, for those of you who are following us online, remember you can ask questions directly using Slido, and the password is #opinion. So I repeat, #opinion. You can ask questions online, and then we'll select some of them here. So in this roundtable format, you have about 3 to 5 minutes each. I will maybe begin with, let's say, Catherine. In your opinion, what is the real contribution that surveys can give to policymaking, and both in principle, so theoretically, what can we bring as academics to policymaking through surveys, and in your own experience?
Yeah, so, well, thank you very much. And also, I look forward to have the debate with the other panelists, and thank you so much for inviting me here. So it's really interesting to also interact with people outside of the academic bubble, as I sometimes do, but to focus on these questions. So I think first, in a kind of normative perspective, oftentimes when you think about policy, we don't only think about it as every 5 years or every 4 years, but a continuous connection between the public and policymakers. I'll just give an example. I'm Dutch by origin. We saw a lot of protest on Dutch streets regarding some of the policy coming out of the European Union that relate to the green transition. So those might be signals that you get, but you also want to make sure what a silent majority that's not necessarily on the streets thinks. So I think it's very valuable just to kind of remember that this connection is something that we're trying to get at through polling. But then I think what can be the kind of value for policymakers is that oftentimes policy requires trade-offs. So it requires, basically when you ask people a set of surveys, they want a lot of things at the same time, right? So they would like to support Ukraine, but they don't want to pay for that, or they want to have the green transition, but they don't want to have an increase in tax hikes. So, you know, these kind of trade-offs, I think, are very important to figure out in surveys. However, many survey, we've, I think, made a lot of advancement that in academic work, but it's very tricky to ask those trade-offs. So what we oftentimes do now is what we call kind of forced choice experiments, where we give people kind of sets of policies, for example, if you think about a policymaker, or we ask people explicitly about trade-offs in questions, and I think then they can be very useful. I'm not so sure that asking the person, well, would you support weapons deliveries to Ukraine, let's say, right, when we're talking about, or a sanction package towards Russia. So that I'm not sure that those questions are actually that useful, because they really kind of only get at a one-dimensional view of how people think about things. And the way that we think about it as academics is that people actually can dislike and like a thing at the same time. They can, you know, let's take the example climate change, you might think that it's really important to do something about the climate, but you don't want to pay for it. You think it's really important to do something for the climate, but you don't want to be yourself affected by it. You don't want your let's say, farming to change within your own country, right? So I think when public opinion can be really useful is when it really gets at these trade-offs and it really tries to understand that in a particular way. And I think the last thing I want to say on that also policymakers have to try to understand better where polling does not help you that much. So what you've seen very much, I'm a political scientist or political economist, what you see now is that actually who responds to a poll has become part of the polling issue, let's say. So it's very strong in the United States when it came to underestimation of Donald Trump support. It was in Brexit, underestimation of Brexit support. So a lot of kind of anti-establishment sentiment politically, or asking people about policies, those people that might be adversely affected, could be either more marginalized, they could be more anti-establishment orientated, that oftentimes we're not getting those people into our polling, especially not when it's a big polling firm that they would think is quote unquote part of the elite, right? So I think polling has a real advantage when we can get these trade-offs, when we really try to understand policies and then for policymakers to design policies in a particular way, i.e. environmental policy with a lot of compensation associated, let's say, if you wanted to think about that. But we also have to really think hard about who we reach and how we also make sure that actually those people where we could see maybe some, let's say, resentment or some opposition to policies are really in our samples and do better in the way to do that. And we were just talking a little bit before. One way to do that is to combine qualitative and quantitative approaches, to combine closed questions and open questions, and use machine learning to try to understand what people think in kind of open questions, to give them games instead of actual surveys. So, there are advancements that we can deal with. So, bottom line, very useful if we get the trade-offs. Then we need to think very hard about how we reach also the target populations that we want, and we need to also make sure that policymakers, really don't look at, a question of like, how much are you going to like my policy, yes or no? I mean, that's usually not very useful, but really try to understand the policies and try to understand how we can design policies that fit and would be accepted by a large part of the population, and in order for us to kind of get that connection between election times.
All right. Thank you very much, Catherine. So let's maybe turn to the Commission's position and to you, Anna. So in your opinion, in a, let's say, honest and direct way, let's say, what really works in the way the Commission currently uses polls and surveys? What do you think are the spaces for improvement? What do you think academics could contribute or think tanks could contribute to your work?
Thank you very much for the question and for inviting me. I will start briefly by saying that Eurobarometer has a 50-year history. Actually, this year we're celebrating the 50th year of its birth, and it was designed at the very beginning as a tool to reveal Europeans to themselves, which I find quite poetic for the European Commission. And we are trying to understand Europeans, and it's revealing Europeans to themselves and to us. So I think, obviously, the main thing that we are trying to draw from these 50 years of polling is understanding the people. There are three different elements of attitudes that we are looking at when we are doing these opinion polls. It's the cognitive, so we need to know the knowledge, the awareness of several policies, so that we can bridge a gap, or so that we can understand where is this gap. It's the affective part of the attitude, so their beliefs, what they want to do, and it's the behavioral part, which is their intentions. So all three. Now, questionnaires and surveys are complex, are large. We're not trying to ask yes/no questions, and we're not having just one question. So we embed into the surveys the complexity of a certain policy. There are several things that we are trying to get out of the surveys. One important thing is the variation in time, and we were discussing previously about the trends. Anecdotally, I'm going to say that in 1974, when we had the very first standard Eurobarometer, people said that their main concern was wages and prices. 50 years later, their main concern is rising prices, inflation, and cost of living. But what has happened in all this period of time is that we have tried to look at different perspectives, and perspectives change based on their vantage point. When you are asking a question about the financial situation, we're going to get a response I'm going to use EU averages most of the time. So to this question, 71% of Europeans replied that their financial situation is good, which is a combination of total good, fairly good. However, when they are asked to say which is the current situation of the national economy, it's the exact opposite. So they have 62% saying it's bad and only 35% saying it's good. Another perspective is how they see the current situation of the European economy. And then again, here is a shift because we have 45% saying it's good and 44% saying it's bad. So we are trying to draw from this perspective and we are trying to have the bigger picture of what people think. Now, I've made, let's say, a mistake, because I'm talking about EU averages, but the reality of the Eurobarometer is that there could be 27 different types of opinions. So when we are looking at results, we don't look at the EU average as the main result, but how it differs or how it's the same between member states. Yeah? And there are questions with very big variations, or there are questions where we have similar responses. Then another thing that is very important for us is to be able to deconstruct the complexity of the policy into simple things. And I think this is a big problem for everyone. The way it's built, the Eurobarometer right now, it's used by my DG, which is DG Communication, for the big standard trend surveys, but also the other Directors General. They're using it, and we have like 30 to 40 surveys per year, and they're really dedicated to smaller policies, because this helps us deconstruct this complexity into smaller pieces so that we can understand. And since we are talking about experiments, well, we didn't really do an experiment in the sense that you're making, but we had a quasi-experiment related to the changeover in Croatia, where DG ECFIN has monitored just before the changeover to the euro, for then a few weeks during the changeover, and the behavior post-changeover, so that they see in all these different formats how people reacted, what they have used, what was effective, and then what can work. And we have done this changeover experiment, if you want, for quite a few countries that have joined the euro area in the past years. So we are trying to learn from these surveys. We are trying to listen to also what you are saying. So we are trying to make sure that we make them leaner, that we get more out of them, that we understand behavior better than just knowledge and the support. So these are the indications that we have. Also, as a way of example, if you want to look at a question that is quite forgotten, which is the quality of the life you lead. In 2004, we had the survey for the 10 non-EU member states at the time that were part of the wave of enlargement, and the level of satisfaction with the life they led at the time was 68% for these two countries. The last survey we had at the end of last year, the level of satisfaction was 86% for the same 10 countries. So what happens is that we have seen also for the other countries that have joined successively, that there is a convergence to the upper level when it comes to the satisfaction with the life they lead post-accession, without the other ones having dropped. Yeah? So of course, crises have an impact. There is a modification, but we see this convergence to the upper level. I think that's a bit what I can explain in just a few words.
Okay, thank you. And finally, maybe for this first round of questions, let's turn to the national perspective. So, Alexis, you represent here a large member state, and one that is very influential on several different policy areas, including the one you work on, that is industrial policy and innovation. I wonder, within your field of competence and within the area you work on, how often you encounter and you make use of surveys? Do you think that surveys can improve the way national governments interact at the European level in intergovernmental negotiations when dealing especially on industrial policy, which is a very hot topic nowadays before the elections?
Well, thanks a lot for inviting me and for having us there. I mean, this conversation is already really interesting for me. So to answer quite quickly to your main questions, how often do we use those surveys? Not that much. And I think the reason for that is, as you said, we have some major trends, but it's always quite difficult to see for policymakers the impact on very specific policies. So we will be influenced, I would say, when the result of the poll are used in impact assessment from the Commission, for instance, and that happens quite often. So in that case, we use the poll as part of an overall assessment, I would say, when it comes to EU policies. However, there is an impact of polls that are not European, but the one that are coming from our own member state, I would say. We have, in France, for instance, studies every 2 months from one of the Sciences Po institutes that covers all the French politics topics. So we can see what are the main interests also of the French citizens. So that's something we can rely on to say that we have some incentive to push on specific issues. And we use a lot of surveys that are addressed to businesses when it comes to industrial policy. So maybe one of the gaps we have there is that we use surveys to test political ideas that we may have. So I will give you one key example. When it comes to the industrial policy field, you said it's a very important field for our government. So we have some major stakes and some major ideas on which we are supposed to work on and defend. And these ideas, we confront them through surveys toward businesses. We've launched in November, December, a surveys to all the businesses in France on what could be the future of industrial policy, what are the main issues you encountered, both qualitative and quantitative. And that's the kind of exercise that is helping us also to shape a bit more our position. So we may have, like I would say, major political guidance, and after that, when it comes to how we translate that, taking it on board also what Catherine was saying, I mean, the balance in between different type of people. We have the employees, we have the businesses, we have also maybe the impact of external policies from France or from extra EU as well. That's the kind of things that we take into account in shaping the policy, but at a second stage, I would say. The first one is really, when it comes to industry, business interests, and overall guidance, I would say, from our politicians.
Okay, thanks a lot for this first round of responses. Before we move to a second round of questions, would you like to react to each other's points or have something to comment on?
Oops. I just realized we realized that the microphone was not working that well. I think what is really important to kind of think about is I think we've moved quite a bit away. I was saying that as already from survey questions, just thinking about them in terms of averages, right? So that averages are actually not often that useful, especially when polarization between people increases. It's like you can get a 50%, but like it's a bimodal distribution, right? So thinking very much about distributions and how we report that also. And I think also the same thing would actually be about policymakers of thinking about confidence intervals, like that things don't come, like these are statistical probabilities that need to be very, so sometimes we say, oh, it's something has increased with 5%, but it hasn't increased with 5%. There was, these were, the both estimates came with a uncertainty and they overlapped. So actually there's been no change, right? So I think what's really interesting is to move forward, is to really try to think about how can we capture, like, what are we really trying to capture is basically people's responses to certain types of policies, right? So we can try to do it strategically to see how everything feels, but often I'm more interested in like kind of reaction or which policy bundles could have a response. And I think then it's really interesting not just to think about levels, but to think about change. So interviewing the same people repeatedly, and then at least, I can, in very methodological terms, I can take away a lot of individual fixed effects, things that just happen to be an attribute of your background, or an attribute of where you live, or whatever, and really look at changes, and also really look more at distributions rather than changes. And I think that we've made really big advancements, also through better statistical packages like Python and R, to kind of represent some of that. And I think that would also be really, really great to see that in kind of on the policy making side, to be very sensitive to what response. I was just responding to like the 65%, right? Like, what does that mean, right? Like, so you could have, a lot of things going on that you're not seeing from that kind of average response. So I think that's also important. We didn't, how to report and how to report it well, and also to communicate to policymakers about what it then actually means. And sometimes, differences in numbers actually are not real differences. They're just fall within statistical probability. So I think that's also an important aspect to what we're discussing here, to make sure that it can be useful for policymakers.
Thank you. Oana, would you like to respond to this?
Yes. Actually, the examples that I gave were above the 5 percentage points. So we are really looking at a change in the attitude, a change. It's not within the 5% margin of error, so that's not really the case. What I also wanted to say is that we are looking at the socio-demographic results. So it's not just looking at a particular country, but we can see the differences when it comes to different age groups, when it comes to their belonging to the rural area or the urban area, when it comes to their gender and so on. So all these have to play into the analysis of the results. It's not just what we see first when we look at results, and that's why I cautioned also about the averages.
Okay, thank you. I have one question from one attendee online, Lucy, who asks everyone in the panel, to what extent can analysis of public opinion in the age of disinformation and deepfakes and populism, how can the analysis help us countering and dealing with these new trends? Maybe we start in reverse order now. If Alexis, if you would like to say something about this, or otherwise I will give the floor to yours.
That's a really interesting question. I would say it helps us to also contradict some big announcements, or because I will take the example, for instance, of industrial policy. We often say, or often hear from some lobbyists that this will have detrimental effect on the environment because we are building, new factory, new mines in Europe and so on. Because people often see one part of the policy, and that's what you said, Catherine, earlier on. I mean, if you look only at the environmental side, of course, you can see all the detrimental effects. But if you look at the needs for new solar panels, for instance, or of new offshore wind farms, because we need more energy, then there is another kind of aspect. People will say, yes, we need to decarbonize our energy mix, for instance. So this also helps when you ask, I would say, the two kind of question in the same survey, to have a more broad view than just going on Twitter and see all the tweets saying that a specific project is not good. One of the example we had in France It's an online app that was launched by the government, I think 1 year ago, called Agora, on which the government asks questions on policy per different themes. So you will have something on AI, for instance, and you will have questions on different kind of impact the AI policies can have. And this is, of course, just the first test. It's a beta app, I would say, and we probably need more people to download it as well. But it helps comparing the opinion on various angles of the same policy, and it's also a way for the government to make sure that we go a bit away from the social network trends, and that people can also suggest questions. And there is some polls that are based on people's question in a way. So we make sure that we have a view that is perhaps a bit more representative, in the sense that the people that are using social media, we've said it earlier on, are also quite polarized. And the people in the middle, they are often those who are not really intervening in the public debate. And that's really important for us to make sure that we have those people on board, and the surveys put those people on board, which is not the case when you just look at media or social media trends on specific policies. And that's why I would say for us it's also really interesting, because when we do negotiate specific files, we hear from lobbyists that there is a huge backlash on one specific aspect or another specific aspect of a policy. But actually, when you look at the broader picture and what's really visible publicly in the media or in the social media, so through those kind of survey, or when we do some focus group or mobilize experts in the field, the policies could be a bit more balanced, I would say, and more acceptable to the people. So I think it's another way to compensate the polarization of the opinion on social media mainly.
Thanks a lot. Oana.
One thing to say about disinformation, that is a subject that can be part of a survey in itself, so we would like to understand it as a phenomenon and how it affects people. And this can be, and it is part of actually what the Eurobarometer is currently doing. So you will find questions like, have you been exposed to disinformation? Do you think that you're affected by this? So it's not just being affected in general, or having an opinion that disinformation is a phenomenon that is affecting the country, but how it affects you personally, and do you feel that you have the right tools to detect it and not to be part of it as well. So that's a study of the phenomenon itself that can be done with opinion polls. And it's also, as I said earlier, bridging those information gaps. So understanding, and we also have polls that are asking, which do you think is the most trusted source of information for you to get information about EU civil protection, for instance, or any other topic, so that we understand what people trust, because disinformation is also a question of lack of trust, right? So trying to map a little bit which are the sources that are considered trusted, so that we can use them to pass the information that will help people. So,
all right, thanks a lot. Catherine?
Yeah, I think it's very tricky. So if you think about answering a survey, it's kind of a weird thing to do, right? So normally people might, well, actually probably we all care very much about politics, but the average person doesn't care about a policy that much. And then also being asked very detailed questions about it in a survey is actually kind of a strange thing sometimes. Hence we were talking about, all of us, I think, of combining it with other things. But I also think that what you now are seeing, and there's been quite a lot of work on that by academics as well, is that doing the poll themselves or conducting the poll itself becomes part of the kind of, or just like the response rate to the poll is part of where people stand politically, right? So that people would just not be willing to talk to certain pollsters, especially if the pollster comes from a government background or comes from a certain newspaper or so on. And that has been, like we've been detailing that's kind of increasing in some ways. And that's been very tricky. So to also get next to the point where you're, I think, very rightfully making, it can be a study subject in and of itself. but that people think that the poll in and of itself is trying to construe a certain reality that they don't agree with, or like what was often discussed as alternative facts, or these kinds of elements, right? So I think it is a real kind of tricky element to deal with as pollsters, and how to do that, and probably the combination of things, or people being able to respond, having more open questions rather than having guided questions, might be a way where you're tapping into that. But I think it's definitely a good question and a tricky thing to deal with in polling.
Thanks a lot. I have one additional question for each of you. Sorry?
There was also
Oh, yeah, okay. All right. Please go ahead. Ask your question.
Sorry, I just saw it. I have also one online. Okay.
Hello, yeah. My name is Oliver Grimm. I'm the Europe correspondent for the Austrian newspaper Die Presse. I have two short questions. One question to Professor de Vries. You pointed to the problem that many people don't reply to polls. So given the European elections coming up, which groups do you think, societal groups, are underrepresented in the polling results we see, and how might that skew the results of the elections? And a short general question to you all about the Green Deal. My question would be, as the media, we were being fed lots and lots of Eurobarometers and other opinion polls showing that people want the Green Deal. They really love it. They're very enthusiastic about it. They want climate policy. I mean, fantastic numbers of Europeans want this. We've been fed this for the past, sorry, maybe not fed. We've been presented with these results, and they're very good, and I guess they're very, very profound for the past 4.5 years. And yet we now see how the Commission is sort of distancing itself from this. And we see that election results in member states didn't add up, because if people love the Green Deal, why didn't they vote accordingly to this? So my question is, are sometimes maybe not the right questions asked? Because the answers you fear you might get might be politically not opportune, right? I mean, 5 years ago, you had Fridays for Future, everyone was very gung-ho about climate policies. Madame von der Leyen and her PR advisor said, this is the thing we have to do. But maybe already 5 years ago, it would have been obvious that if you ask people more granular questions, and you did a paper, I think, before Christmas about this, they would have been less enthusiastic about the concrete effects of the Green Deal. Thank you. Sorry for being a bit long.
All right, thank you. I think we can maybe indeed start then a Q&A, since we have quite a few other questions online, and maybe some of you also would like to intervene. But let me first collect 2 more questions here, or 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll have a round of responses, and then I look at the questions online. Please go ahead.
Hello, Giorgio Clarotti. I'm working in the European Commission, and I want to make a contribution and a question. The contribution is 15 years ago. I was head of unit for communication in DG Employment, while having never worked on communication. That's the careers you do in the Commission. But as an engineer, I read that when you're in charge of communication, it's very important to measure what you say, because your director general is just fed by one person. Your paper was lousy, so she thinks it's lousy. I needed figures. So we had a 3-pronged strategy, focus group with the 27 permanent representations. In social policy, where I was, Commission had no powers, only the power of influence. So we had a focus group every 6 months going back. What do you want? What do you like? Tremendous impact. My director general wanted to close a library because no one comes to the library. Guess what was the communication instrument that the 27 reppers liked the most? The library, because when there is a group of visitors coming, they send them to a library and they come out with all the reports. Second group, the 500 social partners in all 27 countries. We were polling them regularly, and there I would say the strategy that we had is very similar to Orban's strategy, doing polls to pass messages. Maybe right or wrong, we think we were right. He is polling Hungarians by saying absurd things about von der Leyen or Juncker before. It was really influential to make them aware, so polling as a strategy to make people aware. I mean, businesses do it every day, so we were doing it, and it really worked to bring our issues on their agenda. And finally, Eurobarometer. I love Eurobarometer. I was working with Gallup, who was running it 15 years ago. I just use it as my KPI with respect to my Director General. What is the opinion on the Commission's social policy? As head of communication, I claimed to be influencing that. That, of course, is not true at all, but the trend in year 2000 is that the Commission was doing more in social policy, labor law, equal, and the trend was going up. So as you've said, for trend measuring, I think Eurobarometer is fantastic. Question. I'm now in DG Research, and we want to survey Europeans or where we should go under FP10. So the Framework Program 10, which will run from 2027. I don't think it is a good idea because people are not aware, but maybe. We've never done. We've gone to experts, we've gone to member states. I think it's valuable to go back to the eventual final users. Question to you, what would be the value of a poll for something so specialized, but which in the end aims at influencing, we have the Sustainable Development Goals as our KPIs. So what is your experience with that? Thank you. Sorry for having been a little bit long.
All right. If there is a third question from the floor, we can take it. Otherwise, I would ask you to respond. No? Okay. So Catherine first.
Yeah, thank you very much also for the question about the election and then also the Green Deal. I will deal with both of those. So on the European Parliamentary election, the European Parliamentary election is notoriously difficult to project because turnout is very low in certain member states. I mean, think Slovakia, what was it, 20-something, right, last time around. So it's very difficult to know the kind of projection that we're going to get in the election outcome. So we saw recent projections that were made by Cunningham, Hicks, and so on. What they basically do is they feed in the information that you have from previous election surveys, the bias that you have. So, for example, younger people are less likely to respond, marginalized groups are less likely to respond. Some of the people who are more likely to vote for let's say, call them populist parties, are less likely to respond, although that might have changed because they are doing much better electorally today than they did years in the past. So we have some ideas like where these biases come from, and we try to kind of, when we make predictions, try to adjust for that. But it really is very difficult to get this kind of mobilizing effect. And actually, it relates to the second question about your Green Deal. So the way I see it, but you might see it differently, that part of how the Commission interpreted the mandate of the 2019 election is that turnout was up amongst young people, and young people moved to the Greens. That was not a mandate for the Green Deal, right? That was a small section of the electorate that was mobilized. Great, excellent. But that was not a mandate for the Greens. It's notoriously difficult to get a mandate out of European parliamentary elections for the reasons that I've outlined. Turnout, and also, there's not a government at stake in the election, right? It's not the same thing as at the national level. So I think that's the way I see that result, and also when I was with people in the Commission kind of talking about that. And I think there you have to be very careful. So there was no mandating in the 2019 election on the Green Deal. Even Timmermans, who was running as a Spitzen, or a leading candidate in the Dutch case, he was not going on and saying, this is what I'm going to introduce between 2019 and 2024. So even if you wanted to interpret the vote for, let's say, S&D or Greens or some parts of Renew as the support for the Green Deal, I'm not sure where you're getting that from, because that was not how the election was run in 2019, and that's not how European parliamentary elections are run. Maybe now with von der Leyen, she's much more recognized than we just did a poll. I work very closely with the Bertelsmann Foundation or Bertelsmann Stiftung, and we just did a poll that will come out that that von der Leyen has way more name recognition than any Commission president that we've seen before, and that partly has to do, of course, with vaccines, with the Ukraine response. She's been much more kind of profiled. So maybe now people are linking her candidacy, which of course we know that she's running, to some policy elements. But I think from the election, it's super difficult. So then you would say, okay, how do you ask questions? And I think that was my response at the beginning, so I'm not sure, but you can do it in different, I'm not sure asking individual questions about different aspects of a policy is useful. because you basically still are asking, on a scale from 1 to 10, how much do you evaluate X? But what you want to have is really the trade-off between these things. And when it comes to, for example, compensation, I mean, I'm from the Netherlands, so we have done some work. I mean, that may be also why some people know more about it. The kind of farmer protests were already before the European parliamentary election. So we knew that there were issues on compensation, like issues on compensation for certain groups. But then the question is, how do you kind of develop survey instruments that allow you to answer that question next to doing a focus group among people who are already mad, but that, you know, like that only happens when a policy is implemented. And that's what I said, what we often try to do through experimentation. So try to do more complex, so let's say we want to have a reduction in the analysis of nitrogen, right? So the reduction in nitrogen, this means that your tax bill is going to go there, that farmers are going to, like all these kinds of trade-offs that are there. So, but even then, I think you do need to know certain consequences that sometimes you can't really foresee. Right? I mean, part of we have a French person in the panel, of the Gilets jaunes protest came out of the not really fully realizing how much reliance on the car was happening in certain rural areas, that tax hikes on certain fuels had a different response to it. So sometimes you can't anticipate it, but I think as soon as you start seeing it in newspapers or seeing it online, I think what's really important is to develop questions that are not just a one-off and asking people to evaluate, but really ask the trade-offs between certain things, and then really carve out on the basis of social demographics who are the people that are opposing it. But I do have to say that, you know, sometimes polling is done for kind of strategic reasons, maybe as you were maybe also implying, in terms of to say, yeah, I mean, I can design many questions and get 75% approval, right? I mean, but the issue often is to see where the approval drops, right? Like if I give you this policy, but for that you need to pay this, or you need to change your life in this way, or you can fly less, and so then you start seeing the kind of drop-offs. And I think that's really where experimentation can be super useful in surveys. But, you know, it's more expensive to do, it's more complex to do, it's what more academics do than pollsters on average. So, you know, like there's also I also see that there are downsides to that, but I think it speaks exactly to your issue that asking a person, do you support the Green Deal is not a very useful, you know, it's not a very useful question. Or do you support fighting climate change? Yeah, who's not going to say no to that, right? But what you really want to get at is these trade-offs. But I very much agree that on 2019, I'm not sure that was a mandate for some of the policy that were implemented. But I mean, that's up for government to try. And now we'll see that, you know, how this election outcome is going to change potential policies moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, when we did the paper with the trade-offs, actually, it was an experiment. The results were extremely sobering. The moment you asked people to consider the costs of Green Deal support dropped in a very clear way. Okay, thanks. Oana?
I can reply within the remit of my job, which is to head Eurobarometer, so I'm not going to speculate on the politics of it. So first of all, I'm pretty sure that there is no question whether we love or not the EGD in the survey, so I think it was a bit more targeted than that. And then what I want to say is that on climate change, we have regular surveys that are standalone, in which we try to destructure this complexity into different angles, so that we have various answers and not just do you support this and that. Even when it comes to support, I would argue that the difference between very much in favor or fairly in favor would give us an indication whether this is really meant as support or just slightly so. So even there, I would argue that there is a reason to track this kind of attitude. And finally, as a point, since my DG is associated with the policy DGs, what we are trying to do is indeed to blend together in a survey different aspects of it. Therefore, if we have some climate-related aspects, we could add some energy-related aspects or other policies that would indeed allow us to see these trade-offs. It's work in the making, so we are learning as well from the surveys that we are doing, because the point is for us to make use of the results. And this make use is for us to understand and really to be able to have these trade-offs.
All right, thank you. Alexis?
Thanks a lot. I will probably not reply to the Green Deal question because I think you already did so. But maybe to the other question on the FP10 survey. I think it's really interesting to look at this kind of policy really precisely. I mean, in my previous position, I worked in evaluation of public policies of ERDF and ESF program, for instance, and looking at surveys of the impact of ESF policies helped a lot to frame also what we want as next policies in this area. So if you go really specific into surveying the beneficiaries, you can see what the impact of specific programs have been on those beneficiaries. You can also adapt your policies because you will see that for specific programs that you thought were really nice, really interesting, on which you were really able to build on, I don't know, promotion of your public action, the effects on the beneficiaries have been really, really low, while comparing to other policies that were probably more difficult to put in place or less publicized, the impact was way more interesting. I know that on the area of ERDF and ESF, there is compulsory evaluation on every program regionally, and this evaluation are also compiled at the EU level by the Commission. Maybe one thing that I think it's not really well done is this compilation of surveys, because we don't really have the same questions per regions, because every region does its own evaluation. Sometimes they do it themselves, sometimes they do it with consultancies and polling institutes. Sometimes they don't really do polling. So the evaluations are not really comparable, and that's for me a problem if you look at the broader picture. So I think it's an interesting tool when you have to deliver really concrete policy to look at the effects that they have. But the issue is really how you make sure that you don't build your policy only on really specific cases, because some policies will work on specific regions, specific beneficiary groups, but they will not work if you have to duplicate that at the EU level, you know. So maybe here, for me, there is room of improvement on how we make sure that the evaluation of those programs are comparable. I would not say the same, because you don't have the same issues or same policies regionally speaking or nationally speaking, but at least comparable, so you can look at good practices. And if you see that some specific policies were targeting a specific group and you have the same group in another member states, then you can also duplicate the policies. But we are really, I think, missing this kind of data, and that the same for industry as well. I mean, we know that in some member states, specific policies worked because we had specific surveys, we had specific data from the industry. We also have loads of qualitative data, because we know that we receive letters from the industry explaining that something doesn't work, or from NGOs explaining the reverse, and so on. So you can also compare arguments, feelings, and the numbers of complaints that you can have on specific policies. But this is not systematized. So the issue that we have is how we can build on those info to make sure that we don't do something that didn't work somewhere else in our member states, for instance. And that's the example you gave on Gilets jaunes, or on also the farmers. I mean, if we have the data already in one member state and we see that the policy works, it targets the same group with the same issues, then we can also try to compare this kind of policies, which is not something we really do, actually.
Okay, thanks. Extremely interesting, in fact, especially on the evaluation part. As someone who has worked a lot on causal inference, I would say often surveys and evaluations take place at the end to see the impact. But actually, if you really want to know the impact, you have to think it from the beginning, ex ante. You need to include an experiment in the survey from the beginning in order to assess the causal impact of your policy. And for evaluation is essential.
Maybe just on this. I think it's interesting to say that we need to have survey ex ante, but actually there is. Because when you do, for instance, ESF policies, you will have like an interim report, I would say, interim polling with your beneficiaries. You will have the one at the end of the program, but normally the end of the program is also the period when you prepare the next one. So you're doing the ex ante by doing the one that is closing. The issue there is just you need to make sure that you are doing that. In fact, you're using this for long-term policies, and that's maybe the issue. Is if you do ex ante without knowing what you will really do, it's really difficult. Then you need to test IDs, and that's what we do when I was explaining earlier on that we are doing surveys with the industry, testing IDs, and what you said as well. If you do a survey with specific ideas, specific policy trade-off, and so on, then you will be able to judge also what could be better accepted, for instance. But that already exists in evaluation of social policies.
But not so much experimentation. There are sequences of surveys, but the experiment needs to be built into the survey design throughout the entire period to actually assess the causal impact of a certain program. And I think there is, maybe not at the Eurobarometer level, but on individual evaluations, there is a lot of space for improvement, I think. I think you would like to say something on this? So you want
I think it's really interesting to kind of think about it in the way what you were just describing in terms of how you really, if you think about evidence-based public policy, what does that then particularly mean, right? So sometimes it takes a really long time for a policy, to be, for the actual effects of a policy really to be kind of implemented. So I think the long term, I just wanted to kind of underline in this long-term focus and then doing it in particular aspects. And actually what you're describing is what we often call kind of policy experimentation in federations. I mean, not that the EU is a federation, but like that, what you rolling out a policy in one state in the United States and then seeing how it works, giving but and then rolling it out somewhere else. And actually, what we often lack is also this coordination even between national kind of policymakers that do some of these surveys. So we have some of the things at the European level, but sometimes the coordination at the national level is not there. And then it's actually a shame that issues that were or policy that were introduced. I mean, like that. I think many Dutch people they were just waiting for the farmer protests to happen somewhere else, right? Because it was basically the same ways that the policies were implemented that led to so much backlash in the Netherlands that could have probably been prevented if maybe certain attributes of the policies or the way that was communicated was changed. Sometimes it's not even the content, but it's about what you say about the aspects. So I just wanted to illustrate this long-term and coordination across borders actually is also very important.
Thanks. This actually ties well with one of the questions we received online, that is an issue of transparency. Now, Andrea asks, yes, the Commission is relatively transparent, surveys are public, member states not that much. Many governments run opinion polls, but they keep them to themselves, e-comment. So how can we improve that? Should we have a official registry of surveys like some countries have, or maybe, better sharing practices? I will also, maybe this is something for the Commission as well, but I have a couple of other questions from people online, maybe worth considering. Joris asks, to what extent are we actually measure non-attitudes? So how much of the surveys capture indifference? And I mean, this speaks to me directly. A lot of the experimental work that we do actually is, I don't really know, maybe I don't even really care. But this is something that we probably need to explore better. Question for everyone, I would say. And then finally, Leah asks, when things change so fast, when there are so many shifts in society, how can we adapt our mechanisms of polling to actually track better these fast shifting happenings? Okay, so this is the last round. Maybe we start with Oana and then Alexis and Catherine to conclude.
Okay, on transparency, we think it's very important. That's why we do publish not only the reports, but we also publish the full data so everyone can access and see all the polls that we do and the results. So you're preaching to the convicted here. Yes, transparency is important. Then on non-attitudes, that's quite interesting actually. I don't think on top of my head I can really spot one of those questions that I have seen recently. What I can say is maybe the levels of don't knows on some of the questions, but that's not really a non-attitude, or it can be an indication of something else. But it's interesting for us to take note. When it comes to the time, yes, that's quite a challenge. So we are trying to address it, and the big shift that has happened was indeed the change from the in-person to more online and to more telephone, because they have shorter fieldwork durations. However, the huge challenge that we have is that we do these surveys in 27 member states, sometimes in non-EU countries. So the fieldwork is actually much larger. The samples are so big that time is a problem. What we have tried to do is accelerate also the publication of the survey so that we make these results available. And I would encourage everyone to try to look at Eurobarometer and to see them not just for the 2-3 lines that are out there, but the full scale of the results. It's a lot of data that can be used by member states, by academia, obviously. So.
Thank you. Alexis?
Well, if I have to reply on the transparency of survey question, I think there is two different types of surveys, even 3 different types. The first one is the political one. So we definitely, there is comments from some surveys at political level, and this we do not see them. I mean, if it's approval rating of specific issues, if it's asked, I don't know, by our ministers, it's not something that is, of course, shared, and the reason for that is it's there to inform them that if they want to go one way or another, that will have a specific impact on the opinion. But those surveys are not that many anymore. The main surveys that we have, they are already public, because we use surveys. If I take the example I had early on, there is an institute at Sciences Po in Paris that does surveys on all the public policies that the government may envisage, or also the generic trend, I would say, in public policies in France, and all those surveys are public, so you can also access those. And the third one of surveys, the type of surveys, sorry, are the one that I mentioned before. So the one that, for instance, that we did with the industry, testing some policies and so on. For this one, the result will not be totally public, in the sense that we will not be able to share the data of the result. The reason for that is that there is big companies that also reply to the surveys. There is SMEs. There is some may have given information to the government that obviously are not shareable, but the overall result will be shared. So I think the level of transparency is something that needs to be discussed also for the ability to have good answers to the surveys, especially if the answer are not beneficiaries or just only the public. If you look at third party like companies or organization, they will probably be more keen on replying to a specific question if they are not totally public. And when it comes to the non-attitude, I would say that I have absolutely no idea on this point. But for the tracking of varying opinion, I would say there that the media and the social media also give us loads of information, and are probably a way also to say, look, there is a polarized question that appears. We need now to have a survey, and not to wait like a few months on a specific issue. So maybe there is tools not to rush into surveying, but at least making sure that we have a moment now that where we need more concrete and detailed data on specific policies, for instance.
Thank you.
Yeah. So on the transparency. So I also give credit where credit is due. I think that's really good of the Eurobarometer that it's made that all available. It provides also a lot of insight for my master's students, for example, that want to do questions on this. So, on behalf, I think, of many people, thank you very much for that. And I think the more transparency on that, and it varies per member state, right? And it's that will be really really great. Then I think probably respond to the non-attitudes and the kind of shifting. So the non-attitudes, I think, is a quite important issue, because a lot of the things that we poll within the EU are quite complex. And if I ask an average, at least in the polling that I do, if I ask an average European, do you, for example, have enough information to judge the track record of von der Leyen, which, when it comes to vaccines or something, you would think. I mean, we don't even we get less than 30% of people saying that they're able to do that, right? If you ask them knowledge questions that are complicated, some people think Norway is part of the European Union, think that every member state has the euro. I mean, I just go on and on and on, right? Like those would be kind of more simple things. So I think the question of like what people know, which is also the cognitive aspect, is really important. Then in terms of non-attitudes, I think we really have to take it seriously, the fact that many, many, many people do not engage with politics all the time. It's not the main, that's why social media is not, we do a lot of content analysis of Twitter. It's interesting, or whatever it's called now, X. It's interesting, but it's a very small draw, and it maybe affects, of course, how other media report, but it's a very particular kind of environment. So I think it's really important to explain. So also have certain questions that are there. You could also, again, use experimentation to do that, is to provide more information and then see if someone changes their minds on particular things. But I think the non-attitudes is not, and it's really not an underestimated issue. And especially on the EU, you see basically since the Maastricht Treaty, if you think about Europe, then it becomes much more crystallized, right? So as there's more discussion about the EU and domestic member states, people, at least on these general questions regarding to membership or regarding to if they want to see more European integration in certain areas, that you can much better predict that. In the past, when we go to 1974, I mean, people were not as, right? We're not as knowledgeable. So then also the information that you get out of that changes. So I think it's just to be aware of that. And in terms of like the things shifting, so that's actually interesting, because if you go at a kind of higher level, so when you think about left, right, being more cosmopolitan, being more national, more pro or anti-EU, not very particular about policies, there you actually don't see huge amounts of shifts. I mean, we saw, of course, in the Eurozone crisis, we saw in the kind of migration crisis, and then post-Brexit, where we now see that people's responses to membership questions are much more positive than they were in the past. But what you really see is that what changes very much is what's on top of mind for people. So if you ask people about environmental legislation today, you get much more of a sincere response than you got, let's say, 5 years ago, because they were not thinking about environmental legislation. Now they're seeing environmental legislation being played out. So in that way, also the question that was earlier, sometimes it really is this, like public opinion is endogenous or is related to what's happening in the policy space. So it changes also. It doesn't stay the same, right? You see these consequences, and that makes it very difficult sometimes to poll when kind of the mood shifts, right? But I think what we have to be careful of is that we then also don't overcorrect. So before it was like, okay, there's actually a mandate for the Green Deal, and now there's no mandate for the Green Deal. Right? We've gone from one extreme to the other. But like what we just basically find is what you were saying as well, Francesco, is that when people get exposed to the cost, when you ask it in particular ways, when people are having to make trade-offs, you just get different responses. And that's not entirely crazy when you think about our way of thinking about public opinion, is that people are conflicted about certain policies. They like it under certain conditions, under certain elements, and that's often what's called attitude ambivalence. And there we need to like kind of take that also more seriously. And we know that people who are less knowledgeable, people who are less sure what to think. So I think it's also really important to develop survey responses to ask people about what they know, then maybe certain policies, and I said I prefer kind of experimentation to do that, but then also how sure they are, and other things that we do is we get people to actually, we give them, let's say, some incentive, you know, like they can play a game where they can maximize a payoff or something. And they do take that much more seriously. And I think what I'm a bit, and that's the last point I wanted to make on the non-entities, what I'm a bit afraid of is that if we don't coordinate the amount of surveys, so what we've also seen, because surveying has become so much cheaper to do, especially when you do it online, right? We've just seen a ballooning of surveys. So what we know also in some of the panels is that, you know, people are doing this and clicking through, and I now throw out, sometimes if I do an experiment, I have more than 50% of my sample that's not paying attention to the question, right? That actually, when I ask them an attention question, they don't meet the extension check, right? So we do have to start thinking about what kind of surveys are presenting that, and maybe having then coordination and doing maybe one big survey rather than 20 small ones, but would be useful to do, right? So I do think the two questions about the shifting and also about the nanotest are really valid to think about. I don't have all the answers, but I think some ways to, you know, try to think more deeply about how you could get at that and how you make sure that people are really giving sincere responses and that they maybe incentivize some of it, and also doing some attention checks might be a way of trying to see how good the quality of the response is.
Perfect. I gather the last comment is for me and other academics working on constant surveying experiments. Okay, we are over time. Thanks a lot for all of you for your patience and for your contributions, and thanks, of course, to our panelists for this very direct and interesting discussion. And hopefully we will see better policymaking and tailored policymaking to what people really want. Thank you.